Vietnam, whose war? Whose war is it? Is it Vietnam's war or the world's war? Is it America's or Southeast Asia's? Is it our war or is it theirs? This is Gene Jayberg speaking for the town meeting of the Twin Cities area. Town meeting gathers members of the community to discuss issues that face the community. Tonight, an issue that's before the worldwide community on Vietnam, whose war? And to respond to this question and others on our involvement in Vietnam, we've invited 4 informed persons from the Twin Cities to the town meeting. Let me introduce them. Professor Mulford Q. Sibley of the University of Minnesota, the Reverend Alvin Currier, Assistant Chaplain at Macalester College, Dr. Johannes Wen of St. Catherine's College, and Mr. Robert White, editorial staff of the Minneapolis Tribune. At the university, a town meeting interviewed an ROTC officer who recently returned from duty in Vietnam. Major Chase, when did you return from duty in Vietnam?
Just last August.
And where were you serving over there, sir?
I was located in the Mekong Delta. I headed up a 5-man advisory team to a Vietnamese district chief.
This means that you were located in a Vietnamese village?
Right. Small village of about 1,500 people in the Mekong Delta, just 5 Americans there.
Can you tell us a little more about your particular duties there?
Well, the job of myself and my team was to advise the local Vietnamese district chief on both military and civil matters.
What kind of military operations were you involved in?
Well, myself and my team participated in some 48 combat operations while I was over there. These were not with the regular Vietnamese troops, but we were with the local militia, what we call the regional force and popular force troops.
I'm interested in the fact that you say you also had responsibilities in civil life there. What did this mean?
Well, yes, actually, we spend more time on many different types of civic action projects than we did on the military advising. For example, we were very active in educational programs, medical programs, agricultural programs, communications, you name it.
Do you think that our pacification programs have been adequately handled by the press?
Well, my personal experience, I would say that I would like to see more in the press about what is going on in the way of pacification, what they now call revolutionary development. And I would like to see more emphasis placed on it, because really military operations alone aren't going to win that war over there. I think most of us realize this now, that pacification plays a very, very large part in this type of warfare.
I think that while there is a sincerity and an earnestness on the part of our men who are involved over there, very often they are forced into situations and decisions are made here that employ methods that can never win the hearts and the minds of the people. In many ways, I fear that we are involving our boys not in helping to bring democracy, but in using this word pacification. We are actually village by village conquering the country and forcing the people into a situation that very often they don't want to be into. In other words, we have made the decision they're better off dead than red, and we're going to give them the alternative. And so we have been cutting into the land and causing more harm and helping the Viet Cong, actually, more than we have been helping the people that were over there to liberate.
Dr. Wen, what do you think? Has this been really of help to the Viet Cong?
I think that the Vietnamese peasants are very attached to their homes and lands. I think it could be a great hardship for them to be forced to move. But I believe that they force the people to move, but they don't kill their cattle, because cattle in Vietnam, a Vietnamese peasant would rather have his head cut off than his cattle. I don't think they have been doing it. But
there are many reports that they have been. Do you think all these people are liars who are reporting that the cattle have been killed?
Well, you can read all kinds of reports. I also read reports to the contrary. So it depends.
Killed, yeah.
It depends on what report we want to read, perhaps. And I rely more on my friends and relatives who are not, who are strong opponents of the key government.
Been trying to conduct my own pacification program with Al Currier, and I have trouble, Al, with your logic. I stay with you for a while, And then you get to talking about the pacification program and the decisions that we have forced on our people, and suddenly from that to say that we go into a village and decide that the people are better dead than red. This has some implications which I think you weren't really getting at. We're not going in to wipe out the people of villages.
No,
we're going in to try to provide, hopefully, a stability there, and it may be a pretty strong-arm stability provided both by the military and the aid and the special people.
That's what we say, but how do you know that that's what we want to do? I mean, I don't trust Washington anymore at all on these things, and I get more and more distrustful of it. It's lied so often. It's been proven wrong so often that I just think one has to question the premises and the statements that come out of Washington on these things.
Yeah, but I think that if this is the only place that you read it or hear about it, this would be true, but this is probably the most open war and program in history. We've got, I don't know, hundreds of accredited correspondents there, and people such as you quote yourself, and people apparently can write out privately. So it seems to me that the kind of information that is filtering through from all kinds of sources, actually a deluge of information, ought at least to give us some general picture of things going on.
May I ask a quick question of these two gentlemen?
Yes, indeed.
The question is simply this: regardless of the merits of the pacification program, what right do we have to be in there to do these things, whether they're good or bad? I'd like to ask both Mr. Curry and Mr. White that question.
Mr. White, do you want to respond first?
Any more than we'd have a right, then they'd have a right to come over here and settle the civil rights problem, for example.
I suppose if you want to get pick at the legal points, you can go back to the commitments made by the successive administrations. I think you can argue these, but they were made at the request of the governments in being. Then you can argue the other side, as Hans Morgenthau does, that this was a puppet government and therefore it doesn't have any real meaning. It's not a very queer sort of thing, but we were invited. We do have a succession of commitment there. You're making the point that we apparently don't have the right to be there and never really have had. I think the question of whether we not so much whether we should have gone in the first place, to the extent that we have and did, is perhaps somewhat academic now. We could argue that all night, but we are there, and really the question is, what do we do from this point forward? Do we say that the right thing is to pull out completely as you withdraw, to take an in-between step, an enclave concept? I think you mentioned earlier the idea of sanctuary for those who wanted it. I'm not quite clear how you do this without exerting some kinds of force, and how you really determine who does and doesn't want it. In other words, I can't give you a simple, clean, neat answer. It's a tough one.
I'm just curious because I think it's an important question.
Mr. Courier?
Well, I'm more skeptical of the commitment. Actually, the word commitment or pledge or these terms show up primarily with the Johnson administration. And if one goes back to read these documents, such as the Eisenhower letters, and even in the Kennedy administration, one sees that these were very conditional promises. We will do this if you do the other thing, if you carry out land reform and things like this. Many of these conditions were not carried out. And so I question the whole commitment. But on the other side, I would come around to the point in answering Professor Sibley that we are there, and although it may not sound this way in my speaking this evening, my basic concern is the human lives and the people involved. I would hope you would accept that from me. And I feel that pragmatically we have contributed to involving this nation in a war that has really sunk to horrible levels, and therefore any solution must take into consideration the present degree of intensity. And I think an immediate withdrawal would be an invitation for the type of a slaughter that I could not with my conscience justify. Therefore, I would argue negotiated withdrawal and disengagement, and I have perhaps naively a little more faith in what we can do through negotiation than you.
In a recent statement, Minnesota's senior senator, Senator Eugene McCarthy, spoke of the role the United Nations might play in a solution to the Vietnamese conflict.
There is a possibility that as we move on from this point, especially if we were to offer some kind of accommodation, that the United Nations might become a more effective instrument in Vietnam than it has been at the present time. It would, I think, require a kind of strong endorsement and strong urging and strong support from the United States government if this were to take place. It appears as though intermediate to that, it might be easier to involve some of the other nations that have been involved in CETO or in the Geneva Convention.
Dr. Wen?
I agree with Senator McCarthy, but I also should like to remind you that in the spring of 1965, after the 37-day bombing pause, the United States brought the question before the Security Council, which it refused to discuss. And recently, the United States has asked Mr. Wu Tan and has asked the United Nations to help to solve this problem or to bring the sides involved in this war to negotiate. We have asked the United Nations, so this is not a new suggestion. This is what we have been doing.
Question that's difficult when you're talking about UN involvement in North and South Vietnam, again, is a matter of definition, because I think in some people's minds they envision this somewhat as in the Middle East and in Israel, perhaps as in the Congo. It might even be a better example. And of course, the facts are that if this is a premise for UN involvement, then the United Nations simply isn't equipped in terms of the commitment of manpower or resources to go in this kind of strength. This is not to say that the UN should not be more involved, but simply to point out that there are some manpower and logistic difficulties if you were starting from that point.
I think the big issue here that we have to realize with the United Nations is that Red China is not a part of the United Nations. And this is one of the big handicaps for the enemy, in this case Hanoi. Red China was a part of the 1954 Geneva negotiations. And another thing, Dr. Wen has mentioned twice, negotiations in 1965. There's also the story of U Thant's visit in Washington with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and the President on August 6, 1964, in which he was given the light to go ahead and seek negotiations. Within 3 weeks, he had an answer from Hanoi. He made arrangements with the government of Burma and even went to the point of getting hotel rooms in Rangoon. And then he waited, along with our then ambassador to the United Nations, Adolf Stevenson, for the response, which came almost 6 months later from Washington, and the response was, at this point, no. This led U Thant to say on February 24th, 1965, something to the effect that I'm sure if the great American people knew the truth, they would realize that negotiations were possible. But one of the first casualties in war is truth. I think that U Thant feels that he has been thwarted very often. I think it's a tribute to his character that he has carried on so deliberately.
Ambassador George Allen, head of the Foreign Service Institute, spoke this way at a recent Twin Cities Foreign Policy Conference.
The United States is in international affairs and is involved in it all over the world, everywhere. And whether we like it or not, no matter how hard we try, we get drawn into disputes and quarrels. I gave the illustration to some people last night about my last experience abroad was in Greece, when the Greeks and the Turks were at each other's throats over the question of Cyprus. Now, Cyprus was a British colony in the eastern Mediterranean, inhabited by 80% Greeks and 20% Turks. The United States wasn't involved in it. They kept coming to us saying, we want your support to help us on this matter or that. We said, look, Greece, Turkey, and Great Britain are all allies of ours in NATO. We want to be friendly with all of you. We'd like to help in solving this problem if there's any way we can, but don't put it on our shoulders. Don't think that we are got to solve it. We've got enough problems around the world. I saw the next 2 days the students of the University of Athens form up on the public square singing patriotic songs, Cyprus is ours, getting agitated, and slogans and so forth, march down the main street of Athens, straight past the British embassy without even stopping, past the Turkish embassy, the Soviet embassy, straight to the American embassy, break all the window lights out of the USIS reading room and throw the books in the street and burn them. So when I say that when I entered the service in 1930, nobody would have ever dreamed of that. They didn't care what the United States thought. But today, with the position, the strength, economic, political, and military of the United States in international affairs, we get drawn into quarrels between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, between Yugoslavia and Italy over Trieste, between France and the Arab states and Algeria over the Algerian question. In every question around the world anyway, we are in the middle of it. So whether we like it or not, the United States has got to play a role in international affairs.
Obviously true, I think, that the American empire is an enormously powerful entity in the world, ruled by a monarch who has almost absolute authority in international affairs. But the question is how it is to be responsible. So often individuals make statements like Ambassador Allen and they seem to justify all American military commitments thereby. There are many ways of being responsible other than military methods. And I personally, as I have suggested earlier, think that the only way in which American power can be used effectively in the world today is through the use of its economic resources through international agencies for the bridging of the gap between underdeveloped and overdeveloped nations. It cannot, it seems to me, affect world affairs constructively, only destructively, through the use of military power.
Mr. White? I think maybe there's too much, we're giving too much weight to the weight that the monarch can swing all by himself of the military establishment. And the thing that I'm grateful for is that there are so many restraints on the administration. And this is one of the things I must say that I have to admire about going back to Vietnam, about the restraint from unleashing the really awful power that we have. I simply can't agree that by saying that killing is immoral, which it certainly is, and that warfare is something that we should all deplore, that by wishing these things we can make it go away.
Is there such a thing as a war that is in ways just?
I think we should get into a theological debate about the just war theory with Mr. Currier.
Well, I would say yes. I can see all the theologians in the viewing audience doing flip-flops now. Yes, I'm a situational man in ethics, and I think there are cases, and this is where Professor Sibley and I part company, where certain degrees of force must be employed.
War of the Spanish Succession, let's say.
Well, I would say Adolf Hitler.
Civil War,
Germany.
War of 1812. I mean, are there really any 20th century wars that satisfy the theological requirements for a just war, would you say?
Isn't the point, or at least isn't one point, that you can be just as immoral economically if you want to?
Exactly. You certainly can be. This is no justification for economic immorality. We're exploiting the world today, as a matter of fact. The developed nations are.
Let's move to another issue now, gentlemen. The former president of the United Nations, the General Assembly of this institution, Dr. Charles Malik of Lebanon, was in the Twin Cities for a lecture series at Augsburg College. We asked him if the United States was trying to stifle legitimate revolution in some of the developing nations.
I don't think you are preventing them from having their own revolutions. I think temperamentally you would feel happier because of your own experience in the past if things did not take place through violence but through peaceful, gradual development. But there will be all kinds of revolutions and upheavals and changes of government and coups and all kinds of things in the future. And I think the United States is not going to interfere in how people want to bring about their own changes. So here again, there is room where it is possible for slow, gradual evolutionary growth, and where people want to experience a revolution. Why? All right, let them have it.
The big problems facing us right now, the revolutions are coming, and evolution is not going fast enough for many people in the world. I think that we have been talking a lot this evening about communism or the East-West struggle. Last summer I was at an international conference where there was a Russian delegate. His name is German Trotsky. And the delegates from Asia and Latin America and Africa got up, and they always pointed at both German Trotsky and Al Courier and called both of us imperialists and both of us warmongers. And German would get up, beating his interpreter to the stand, saying, "Niet, niet, niet, that isn't true. Don't put us in the same boat." I was also thinking of the fermenting revolutions in Latin America. One of the things at this Christian conference was the pleading statement of Latin American Christians that for them to sit by and allow the present oppression to continue in Latin America was for them, in fact, to become murderers. And so they did not have the choice of evolution or revolution, because if they didn't grasp the tool of revolution, which also involved violence, they would be condoning the oppression and the stifling of human liberty in Latin America. And so they said for them it was not a question of war or peace. It was a question only of which war are you going to take in order to get the peace. We have to grasp the revolution. This is our Christian responsibility.
Is it possible, Professor Sibley, that we have not allowed a revolution that is in ways needed and wanted to occur in Vietnam?
I think that's very possible, indeed it's probable, and it's ironical when you consider the United States was born through a revolution.
Mr. White.
But aren't we saying at the same time, and I think Latin America is an excellent example of some of the imperatives of the 60s, that revolution there is, it's not apt to take place, it's going to take place and has taken place. And that the problem there is perhaps that we have been too late, and that we have to be in, by we, I mean the United States, and in concert with the Latin American nations and peoples, that we have to play our own part in the revolution to try to make it peaceful. Now, I'm not talking about military means, but just simply the revolution in economics and social progress, and that if we are not involved, then indeed we are going probably to have to face the kinds of decisions that we have had to face in Vietnam. Are we going to sit by while there is revolution of the violent sort?
Mm-hmm. At this point, I would agree with the statement of Dr. Sibley that we have to put more emphasis on economic revolution or evolution. But right now, I'm very frightened that what is going on in Latin America is actually, as the case of Colombia, which I have been a little bit more closely involved with lately, we're sending in military people to support the 24 ruling families of Colombia, military advisors, and interestingly enough, one of the figures that I identify very much with was the priest, Camilo Torres, who finally felt that he had to go over to the side of the guerrillas in an effort, in an attempt to make the revolution Christian and to make it a humanizing process rather than a thing that would destroy the country.
Of course, we heavily subsidize the Brazilian dictatorship.
But what you're both saying, I think, is really the kind of thing that in some ways, many ways, that I would agree with, that here that we're too late. Maybe we're doing the wrong thing, or maybe we're doing the right thing now. What we have to do, it seems to me, is to avoid being too late, and not solely by economic means, but by the some of the very questions that the alliance was set up to accomplish, the underlying social reforms, the land reforms, and the kinds of things that will make possible democracy or at least the right of self-determination to some reasonable extent by the people there. But that if we let these opportunities go by, then comes the revolution and the awful dilemma.
Right.
When comedian Dick Gregory was in the Twin Cities last fall, a town meeting taped his comment on Vietnam.
The day is over. It's very interesting to think that one day I might have to go to Vietnam with my life laying on some cold dirt in a strange land away from my wife and 5 black kids, trying to guarantee a foreigner instant freedom while my 5 black kids gonna get theirs on the installment plan. If I think that way, I hope I get lynched before I leave here.
The point, of course, is not whether Mr. Gregory's kids are black or green or white. The point that he's expressing, if I understand him correctly, is that this is a war that he doesn't believe in and he doesn't want to be involved. But I think that he forgets the requirements of citizenship, that if he wants to change what the country is going to do, then he has every right and obligation to change it, but not to say, the country having taken this course, I'm not going to go along.
Would you say that about citizens under Hitler's Germany, too, that they had to go along with Hitler?
No, I think that they should have. I think that where they were weak and wrong was in not trying to do something about it. But I would consider that this is not, in any sense of the word, a representative government with the Third Reich.
Gentlemen, before we disband our panel this evening, I'm interested in getting a kind of summation of your convictions and views. Let's do this as we close our discussion on Vietnam, Whose War? Mr. White, what's your summation view?
Probably the hardest thing to do is to agree. It's easy to criticize. I don't want to be on record as an all-out hawk or apologist or unqualified supporter of what the administration is now doing, but I think my view would have to be summarized by saying that by and large, in Vietnam, I think we are following the right course.
Mr. Courier?
I would like to take off by taking up Mr. White's comment about the citizen's responsibility and asking the question, who is most to blame? Certainly it's not the servicemen, who are giving much more than anyone else for what they believe is a just cause and a human cause and a right cause. I would even argue that for the Viet Cong, who believe that they are fighting for their homeland and freedom. I would argue that also Ho Chi Minh is not that much to blame. He went to the negotiating table with the French in 1946, and he went again to Geneva in 1954. Nor would I argue that the man in the White House, Mr. Johnson, is the one most to blame. But I say that I am the one most to blame. And we who sleep too easily too many nights, when the lives of too many people are being threatened and too many lives are being snuffed out. So in the last resort, I would say that I am the one to blame, and those who are watching a panel like this, who are not involved in doing what they can for these people, are the ones to blame.
Thank you, Professor Sibley and Winn, Mr. Courier and Mr. White, for your comments and concerns expressed on Vietnam, Whose War? And so the debate goes on. And what are you going to say? For town meeting is people. People like you and me. People talking about the issues that face the community and the world. And people preparing to do something about their beliefs. This is Gene Jayberg speaking for the town meeting.